You know, I never believed in ghost stories. I mean, who would? Those things are just tales people tell to scare kids, right? At least, that's what I thought until the night everything changed. My name is Henry Thompson, and I've lived in Millstone all my life. It's a quiet town. Not much happens here, except for the rumors about Hawthorne Mansion. Folks around here say it's haunted, that the place is cursed. But me? I always figured it was just an old, decaying house with too many stories attached to it. As a journalist, I've covered my fair share of local legends, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. It all started with a simple dare. You know how it goes. A few drinks, some friends, and suddenly someone suggests something crazy. That night, my friends and I were talking about the mansion, laughing at the idea of ghosts. Why don't we go check it out ourselves? I said, half joking, not expecting anyone to take it seriously. But before I knew it, we had a plan. The four of us, me, Mike, Sarah, and Jen, decided to spend the night in Hawthorne Mansion. It sounded like a good story for the paper, and honestly, I was curious. How could I resist a real-life ghost hunt? We picked a Friday night, the perfect time for something like this. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and there was a full moon to light our way. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness as we packed our gear. It's funny, I wasn't scared, not really. I guess I didn't expect anything to happen. We all figured we'd have a few laughs, maybe spook each other, and then call it a night. But there was something about the mansion, even from a distance, that felt off, like it was waiting for us. The mansion had always been there, on the edge of town, looming over Millstone like a dark cloud. As kids, we'd make up stories about it, but no one ever went near the place. It was just too creepy. But now, standing at the gate, I realized how massive it really was. The place was falling apart, ivy crawling up the walls, windows shattered, and the front door hanging on its hinges. The closer we got, the more I could feel this strange heaviness in the air, like the house was alive, watching us. I've walked into plenty of abandoned buildings for work, but this was different. The mansion felt wrong, like it didn't want us there. But we pushed forward, laughing off the unease as we crossed the threshold. The door creaked loudly as we opened it, and inside, it was dark, colder than it should have been. The smell of damp wood and dust filled the air, and I swear I could almost hear whispers. "This is gonna be one hell of a story," I joked, trying to shake off the feeling that maybe, just maybe, we were in over our heads. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened to that feeling, but we were already inside, and there was no turning back. The four of us stood in the foyer, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. I didn't realize it then, but that was the calm before the storm. Something was waiting for us in that house, something that had been there for a long, long time, and we were about to wake it up. The moment we stepped onto the property, I knew we were in for more than we bargained for. The Hawthorne Mansion wasn't just a house. It was a presence, almost as if it were breathing with us. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows that danced across the overgrown lawn. The trees around us swayed gently in the wind, but the house itself stood still, ominous and foreboding. I glanced at my friends, and I could tell they felt it too. This wasn't going to be just another night of fun and games. As we approached the front door, the air grew colder, and I could feel a slight shiver run down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, but there was no denying the tension building between us. Mike was the first to speak, trying to break the silence with a joke about haunted houses, but even he couldn't mask the unease in his voice. The closer we got to the door, the more I could feel this invisible force, almost like the house was daring us to enter. This is it, I thought, no turning back now. The door groaned as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. We stood there for a moment, flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing a grand but decayed interior. Dust particles floated in the beams of light, and the faint smell of mildew filled the air. It was colder inside, much colder than it should have been. "You feel that?" Sarah whispered, rubbing her arms as if trying to ward off the chill. We all nodded, the nervous energy between us palpable. We stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind us with a force that made us all jump. Jen let out a small yelp, and Mike chuckled nervously, "Guess the house wants us to stay." But there was no laughter in his eyes. We all knew something wasn't right, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. So, we did what anyone would. We pretended everything was fine. "Let's check out the living room," I suggested, trying to keep things light, but the tension was already starting to get to me. As we moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaked under our weight, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The mansion's grandeur was undeniable, even in its decayed state. Ornate moldings, dusty chandeliers, and antique furniture covered in white sheets. It was like stepping into another time. But the further we went, the more it felt like the house was watching us, waiting for something. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew my friends felt it too. We reached the living room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was a large open space with high ceilings and a massive fireplace that dominated one wall. The furniture was old, covered in a thick layer of dust, and the wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing dark stains underneath. We stood there for a moment, taking it all in, when suddenly the temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. "Did you guys feel that?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. Something was definitely wrong here. I looked around the room, and that's when I noticed a painting on the wall, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a portrait of a woman, her eyes dark and hollow, staring straight ahead as if she could see right through us. I couldn't explain it, but something about that painting sent a chill down my spine. I turned to my friends, ready to suggest we move on, but before I could speak, we heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was just the beginning, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. We hadn't been in the mansion long before things started to get strange. At first, it was just little things, sounds that didn't belong, shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. But then we heard it, a faint muffled sound, like someone crying. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as we stood there, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, coming from somewhere deep within the house. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to laugh it off, but the laughter didn't quite reach our eyes. "Probably just the wind," Mike muttered, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were spooked. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just an old house, creaking and settling, but that sound, it was too real. Too human. My heart was racing, and I could see the tension in my friends' faces. We were all thinking the same thing, though no one dared to say it out loud. What if the stories were true? We decided to keep moving, hoping that whatever we heard would stop if we just ignored it. But as we made our way through the dusty, abandoned rooms, the crying only seemed to follow us, growing louder and more desperate. It was like the house itself was alive, filled with the echoes of a past too painful to let go. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this place than we had thought. It wasn't until we reached the grand staircase that we saw her. Just a fleeting glimpse at first, a shadow moving at the edge of our vision. We all froze, staring up at the landing, where the figure of a woman stood, her back to us, her head bowed as if in deep sorrow. She was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown, her hair hanging in loose, dark waves down her back. For a moment, none of us moved, too shocked to react. It was as if time had stopped, and we were caught in some terrible, waking nightmare. Jen was the first to break the silence. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded, unable to tear our eyes away from the figure. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanishing around the corner at the top of the stairs. The air around us seemed to thicken, and the silence that followed was almost suffocating. We stood there, paralyzed by fear, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. Had it been real, or were our minds playing tricks on us? But deep down, I knew it had been real. There was no denying what we had seen. The woman, whoever she was, had been as real as any of us. And in that moment, the mansion no longer felt like an adventure or a fun way to pass the time. It felt like a trap, a place where the past and the present collided in the most terrifying way possible. I could see the fear in my friend's eyes, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there. But something kept us rooted to the spot, unable to turn away from the horror that had begun to unfold. I wanted to suggest we leave, but the words caught in my throat. It was as if the house itself was holding us there, refusing to let us go. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something darker, more sinister. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the sound of crying returned, louder this time, more urgent. It was coming from upstairs, where the woman had disappeared. We all knew what we had to do, even if it was the last thing we wanted. We had to follow her. We hesitated at the foot of the staircase, the air thick with fear and anticipation. There was a collective understanding between us. If we were going to get to the bottom of this, we had to follow her. But each step we took felt like it was drawing us deeper into something we weren't prepared for. The wooden stairs creaked beneath our weight, the sound echoing through the mansion like a warning. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every breath felt heavier. It was like the house was alive, feeding off our fear. As we climbed, the crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I kept looking back at my friends, their faces pale and strained, each of us searching for some kind of reassurance that we weren't losing our minds. But the further we went, the more the mansion seemed to close in on us. The walls felt like they were narrowing, the air growing colder with every step. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched out before us, dark and foreboding, lined with old portraits whose eyes seemed to follow us as we passed. The woman's figure appeared again, just ahead of us, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were leading us somewhere. We followed, unable to resist, even as dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. Her cries filled the air, now so loud they were almost unbearable, echoing in our heads long after they faded into silence. It was as if the mansion itself was amplifying her pain, forcing us to feel every ounce of her torment. I wanted to turn back, to leave and never look back, but something kept pulling us forward, some dark, unseen force that wouldn't let us go. We reached a room at the end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar, and I knew without a doubt that this was where she wanted us to go. The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on us like a weight. I pushed the door open, my hand trembling, and we stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from our flashlights, revealing what looked like an old nursery. Toys and furniture, long abandoned, lay scattered around, covered in dust and cobwebs. But there was something else in the room, something that made my blood run cold. In the corner, where the light barely reached, I saw her. The woman from the staircase, sitting on the floor, her back to us, her head bowed. Her cries had turned into soft whimpers, and as I watched, she slowly turned to face us. Her face was a mask of agony, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. She looked right at me, and I felt a wave of terror unlike anything I'd ever known. It was as if she was trying to tell us something, something that had been lost to time, trapped within these walls. Jen let out a strangled gasp, and the woman's figure began to dissolve, fading into the shadows as if she were never there. But the feeling of dread remained stronger than ever. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the walls closing in around us. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air itself was being sucked out of the room. Mike reached for the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping us inside. We were no longer in control. Whatever was in this house had us in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. The tension between us was palpable, each of us struggling to keep it together as the reality of our situation sank in. We were trapped, and the house wasn't going to let us leave until it had finished what it started. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping closer, and I could feel the walls closing in even tighter. The woman's cries started again, this time coming from all around us, and I knew we were in deeper than we ever should have been. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was a nightmare, and we were caught in the middle of it. The silence that followed the woman's disappearance was deafening, pressing on us like a weight that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. We knew we couldn't stay in that room, so we pushed forward, deeper into the mansion, hoping to find a way out, or, at the very least, some answers. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense, as if the house itself were shifting around us. It felt like we were walking in circles, but the mansion was so massive, so confusing, that it was impossible to tell for sure. I kept my flashlight trained on the walls, searching for anything that might lead us to safety. We found ourselves in front of a heavy wooden door, different from the others. It was older, more ornate, with strange symbols carved into the frame. None of us wanted to open it, but we didn't have much of a choice. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the darkness. A sense of dread washed over me. Whatever was down there, it wasn't something we were meant to find. But we couldn't turn back, not now. We had to see it through, no matter how much every instinct screamed at us to leave. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the basement, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were damp, the smell of mold and decay almost overwhelming. As we reached the bottom, our flashlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The basement was vast, larger than any of us had expected, with a low ceiling that made the space feel even more oppressive. In the center of the room was an old, forgotten altar, surrounded by the remnants of a ritual that had taken place long ago. Candles, long since extinguished, lined the edges of the altar, their wax melted into strange shapes. Symbols were etched into the stone floor, symbols I didn't recognize, but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of fear. This wasn't just a haunted house, this was something far darker, something that went beyond anything we could have imagined. The air was thick with the feeling of something ancient, something evil. And then we saw it. At first, it seemed like just a reflection, but as we stepped closer, we realized it was more than that. An ornate mirror stood at the back of the room, its surface cracked and tarnished, but still reflecting the dim light of our flashlights. And in that reflection, we saw her again, the woman from the staircase, her face clearer now, more vivid. Her eyes were hollow, her expression one of pure agony, and I could feel her pain as if it were my own. She was trapped, bound to this place by whatever dark force had been awakened here. And as I stared into the mirror, I realized the truth: this was no ordinary ghost. She was the victim of a curse that had been placed on this mansion centuries ago, and her soul was doomed to suffer for all eternity. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. We had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed, and now we were part of it. The woman's figure began to move in the mirror, her eyes locking onto mine, and I felt a cold hand grip my heart. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a warning. Whatever had happened here, whatever ritual had been performed, it had left a stain on this place, a darkness that would never fade. And now it had its sights set on us. The room seemed to close in around us, the walls narrowing as the air grew colder. The mirror began to crack, the glass splintering as the woman's cries filled the room, louder than ever before. We needed to get out of there, but I could feel that same force holding us back, rooting us to the spot as if daring us to leave. But we couldn't stay, not with the knowledge of what we had uncovered. We had to escape before the mansion claimed us just as it had claimed her. The moment we realized the true horror of what we'd uncovered, panic set in like a fire, spreading through us with terrifying speed. We needed to get out now. Mike was the first to move, darting for the door that led back up to the main floor. But as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The sound echoed through the basement, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped, locked in with whatever dark force had claimed this place. The woman's cries grew louder, filling the room with a sound that seemed to pierce right through us. It wasn't just fear I felt, it was despair, a bone-deep sorrow that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I could feel the air getting colder, almost freezing. Sarah and Jen clung to each other, their faces pale with terror, while Mike continued to struggle with the door, his efforts growing more frantic by the second. I knew we couldn't stay here, but every instinct told me there was no way out. The mirror began to crack further, the sound of splintering glass cutting through the cries. As the crack spread, the woman's figure in the reflection grew more distorted, her face twisted in pain and anger. I could feel her presence closing in on us, the air thick with her torment. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off our fear, our panic. I could feel it pressing in on me, a heavy weight that made it hard to move, hard to even think about escape. But we couldn't give up, not yet. Mike finally gave up on the door, turning to us with a look of desperation that sent a chill down my spine. "We have to find another way," he said, his voice trembling. I nodded, trying to push down the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. We started searching the basement, our flashlights flickering in the darkness, revealing more of the strange symbols etched into the walls and floor. It felt like we were in some kind of twisted maze, the walls closing in, the air growing colder with every step. It wasn't long before the shadows started to move again, creeping closer, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human. The woman's cries turned into whispers, voices that seemed to come from every direction at once, filling our heads with words we couldn't understand. I could see the terror in my friend's eyes, and I knew they were feeling the same thing I was. This was no longer just about getting out. It was about surviving, about making it out of this nightmare with our sanity intact. Finally, we found a small, hidden door at the far end of the basement, half obscured by debris. It was our only chance, but as we reached for it, the whispers turned into screams, filling the room with a deafening roar that made us all freeze in place. The walls seemed to shudder, the air vibrating with the force of it. For a moment, I thought we wouldn't make it, that the mansion would claim us just as it had claimed the woman trapped in the mirror. But then, with a strength I didn't know I had, I shoved the door open, and we burst through it into the night. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the mansion, the cold night air burning in our lungs. The door slammed shut behind us with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine, and as I looked back at the dark silhouette of the mansion, I knew we had escaped, but we weren't free. The horror of what we'd seen, what we'd felt, would stay with us forever. We had all changed that night, marked by something far darker than we could ever explain. And deep down, I knew that the mansion wasn't done with us yet.